Hi, I'm Barbara Peters for the Poison Pen, and I am very pleased to be talking to my author, or not my author any longer, but for many years my author at Poison Pen Press, Donis Casey. Hi, Donis.
Hi, I'm so happy to see you. I'm so happy to see my own face. No one's seen my face in so long. So I put on actual makeup for you and jewelry and
Wow,
everything. It's just unbelievable. I even have on pants.
I am impressed. And nobody could tell, right? Well, I came down to the bookstore. I've been doing quite a few of these from home because I have a series of interesting photos. So it looks as though I'm in my library instead of my disgusting office. But anyway, I'm here at the Poison Pen. And unfortunately, the book that we came to talk about, Valentino Will Die, which is the second book in your Bianca Donchereuse series, is not here. But I'm going to hold up a copy of The
Well,
Wrong Girl,
here's
and
the
you
back.
are going to hold up the cover of Valentino Will Die.
Yeah, they sent it to me, even though it looks backwards here, but
No, it doesn't. It looks absolutely fine. And I see that there's a common theme here, which is
beautiful
beautiful
old
women.
ladies.
Yep. And we're in the 1920s Hollywood, that sort of early golden age of Hollywood when there was lots of glamour, but much of it was fake. Much of it depended on PR people and so forth. Um, And I think we should talk about Bianca Dangereuse because she's actually a spinoff from your Alifair Tucker series. She's one of Alifair's daughters. And
Yes,
her
yes.
origin story, well, this is her second origin story because originally she was a character in one of the Alifair Tucker books and
Right.
came to Tempe, Arizona, where you live,
Yes.
in order to be cured of a lung complaint. That's right. The Wrong Hill to Die On, one of my favorite books.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
tell us about her when she was young and then, I mean, really young, and then what happened to her.
Well, when the Alfair Tucker series started off with the very first book in 2005 called The Old Buzzard Had It Coming, and this daughter, Blanche, is the eighth child of Alifair's 10, and this child was only 6 years old at the time, so she was just one of the bunch for several books. But I was so prescient, apparently, that I made her from the beginning. I made her so pretty that Alifair was worried about her being so pretty because she was afraid she was just gonna, she's get in trouble for being so, for to be a kind of a victim for being so pretty in that particular time and place. And she, as Blanche grows up, as the girl grows up, she does begin to use her beauty to get things. And Alifair's worried about her. And she's kind of bored and kind of wishes she was somewhere else all the time, all through the whole series. And by the time I reached the 10th book in the Alifair series, it was 1919, and it was just after the war. And I moved these books forward one year at a time. And I thought, well, now it's 1920, and the world has changed. The World War I has changed everything. And they're no longer as isolated as they used to be. The whole world has come in, and these kids, the younger kids, are in a different world than the older kids were, and they want to get out. And how can you keep them down on the farm, basically, anymore? And so Blanche decides she wants to leave, and she gets her opportunity, unfortunately, with somebody whose idea is to sell her to a brothel, and she manages to get away from him and make her way out to California. And by hook or by crook, she gets lucky and falls in with a very kind movie star who helps her get started in the movies, and everything ends up well. She ends up becoming a silent movie star herself. So I thought I got the idea because she was so pretty. Also, I had already made her out to be rather selfish, and I had already taken her out to Arizona, and uh, it just everything just sort of came together, sort of fell together when I realized that she loves the movies and she's going to try and get in the movies, and she does, and it works out. The only problem with Blanche is everything worked out beautifully for her, but she's but she's terribly guilt-ridden for having run away. So throughout the whole story, she she's kind of guilt-ridden, even though she has everything worked out for her. And
Well, she lied to her parents and she ran away from home with this sweet talking seducer.
she never
She was,
ran away without even leaving a note. Yeah.
yes. But, going back to The Wrong Hill to Die On, which took place here in Tempe, there was a movie company here during that book. Blanche had a lung infection, and her mother, Alifair, brought her out to stay with her sister in Tempe, hoping because Arizona, back in the days before pollution and all the rest of it, was a place that people came for lung complaints. Those of the Doc Holliday story, for example, um, came here to, in theory,
Hmm.
cures tuberculosis, or at least learn to live with it. So while Blanche and Alifair in Tempe, Blanche's sister, who is unhappy with her life dissatisfied, also falls in love with the movies because there's a movie company there, and wants to run away, and in fact boards a train, to run away to Hollywood and reboot her life. And I won't say what happens there, but anyway, so you did lay the seeds for Blanche
I
to do
did.
that.
Yes, it's interesting because it's interesting how things work out. Because when I was doing the research for Wrong Hill to Die On, I knew that I wanted to bring Alifair out to Tempe. But when you've got a woman who has 10 children and lives on a farm, you have to have a really good excuse for her to go anywhere or do anything. So I thought about the only way that she'd feel like she could go visit her sister in Tempe uh, was if something happened to one of the children. So, in doing my research, I thought, well, I'll just make Blanche get sick, and she can take Blanche out to Tempe to get well. And while I was doing my research, I discovered that they actually were shooting about the same time that I was going to have her come out there. There actually was a Hollywood movie being shot in the streets of Tempe. So it it just worked out beautifully, and I thought, well, this is just perfect. And I had made the sister, Alifair's sister, that she went out to visit, rather like Blanche, in that they kind of looked alike and they had the same kind of personality. And the sister's also bored with her own life, and the movies offers her, looks like a great escape. And Blanche is quite fascinated. So once I reached 1920, and Blanche has got the movies in her head, and somebody offers her to go into the movies, and it just all worked out perfectly without my actually having to. I had already set it up.
But you did. And one reason that she's very good in these silents, with the adventure, is she's a natural stunt woman because she grew up on a farm. So she grew up riding horses and doing all kinds of devil may care things. And
Yeah,
so,
when she does get out to, when she runs away with this evil guy, and when she finally, she's only 15. So she buys his malarkey, and he's going to take her out to California. But when they get to Arizona, he decides he's going to get rid of her. He wants to sell her to a brothel, but she escapes and runs off up into the hills around Prescott. And Tom Mix's uh, production, a farm, he owned a farm there, and he actually shot movies up in that particular area at the time. And so I thought, well, she'll stumble on this movie that's being made. And she did, and got a little job working in the kitchen on this movie. And like you said, she's a natural stunt woman. She grew up on the farm, and she gets a part in the movie because she's so good riding horses.
right.
So, and besides that, Tom Mix is also from Oklahoma, so he sort of took her under his wing, and the female lead of the movie too, who was just a very kind woman, and also took her under her wing. So that's how she managed to end up out in California in the movies in the first place, because there was a movie actually being shot at the time, both times, that Blanche was in Arizona. So it was just incredible. Sometimes you don't even have to make things up; they just fall into your lap.
So Bianca Dangereuse is the screen name that she, instead of Blanche Tucker, she's Bianca Dangereuse.
Right.
and she does a series of exotic films. And in The Wrong Girl, we won't. I mean, it's partly the origin story of Blanche getting to California, and partly a mystery because there is a death involved. But let's not spoil that by talking about it. It also brings in a ruthless crime boss who, in the guise of a elderly woman who turns out to be, a local crime boss, and a private investigator who somehow or other gets himself hooked up with the crime boss, and it is now stuck trying to figure out how to get out of it. So when we come to Valentino Will Die, we have all of these things in motion. We
Right.
have Bianca Dangereuse, a dazzling star. We have the movie star that helped her, um, falling further prey to addiction. We knew that she drank too much and she doped too much in the first book, but now it's become much more critical. She has a wonderful Black woman, not Bianca, but the movie star, who has been her dresser and looked after her and so forth. So she's part of the cast. We have the private eye. We have Katie Dix, the gangster woman. So all of those are there. But Bianca, because she's become so like a meteor, just rocketed into stardom, has become friends with the Fairbanks, with Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, some of the great names of Hollywood in the 1920s. And one of them is Rudolph Valentino. So it's not surprising they are cast in an action film
Right.
together.
Together. And one thing that they really have in common, they're just friends, because Rudolph Valentino, he was like the first big sexiest man alive, heartthrob, and people were just crazy about him. And he was really flummoxed by the whole thing. He didn't understand what was going on, and he didn't particularly enjoy it. And he and Bianca have that in common, because she's also, even though she's fictional and he's not, but she's also a giant movie star with no privacy anymore. And she doesn't enjoy it either. So they have that in common together. So they're just good friends. And they're finally are doing a movie together in late 1926. And they're both tired, and they're both tired of their fame, and yet they can't, they enjoy the perks of the fame. They can't really get away from it or get out of it, but they enjoy being together. And Rudy, though he's not been well, he hasn't felt well. It's 1926, like I said. And so she invites him to come out and stay at her house while they're shooting this movie for a while, and she'll take care of him and make him some nice food and stuff like that. And while they're at her fabulous estate up in the Beverly Hills, a neighbor to Mary Pickford, as a matter of fact, and Douglas Fairbanks, and he admits to her that he's been receiving death threats, that people have been leaving, that someone has been leaving notes for him in the most unlikely places saying Valentino will die. So he's been, and he can't imagine who's done it, who wants him dead. He said he has lots of enemies, he has lots of debts, there's a lot of crazy people after him, and he can't figure out who's trying to kill him here. And Bianca says, well, I know a guy. And so she contacts the private detective, Ted Oliver, the private detective, and asks him if he'll look into it and see if he can figure out who's trying to kill Valentino. And she doesn't realize that the crime boss has already asked Ted to look into who's trying to kill Valentino, because she has an idea that this might be lucrative for her. So that's how that starts out. And then they finish the movie. Rudy goes on tour for Son of the Sheik, which is the last movie that he made. And when he gets to New York, then the last leg of his tour, he falls ill and dies. And she's horrified and goes to New York to be with him as he's dying. And he dies and says, well, someone's killed me. I've been poisoned. So the whole thing is she has to set out to figure out with, they take him back to California, and between her and Oliver, they have to figure out who killed Rudy, if anybody did. And one thing that really interested me when I was doing the research for this is that when the real Rudolph Valentino died, immediately there were all kinds of rumors about someone had killed him, that someone had poisoned him. And again, I almost didn't have to make things up because there were so many rumors about what had really happened to him and who had really killed him, and how he actually died. And it was a circus too. It was a big circus. There were like 50,000 people trooped by his body to look at it as he lay in state in New York, until finally they had to cut the crowd off because they kept taking souvenirs out of the room where he was laying. It was just incredible. He's the very first really amazing star like that. It was just an amazing circus. The way that Valentino was beloved. People killed themselves after he died because he was only 31, and so it was just sort of a he's, you know, this romantic. He became a kind of a romantic figure because he was so good looking and he was so young and he died so mysteriously, and so it was just a whole big deal at the time. But it really gave me a wonderful basis for making this movie, for making this story, making this book. I think of it in my head as a movie. I actually write it as though it's a movie, the book. And so I see it in my head as a movie, and her grief at how Valentino died and what they had in common and everything. It was really a sweet story to do, I thought, because of the way that they were together. Rudy was a really fun and interesting character too.
Well, a lot of them are. I do think, you know, it's nice. It's interesting for the reader that you blend real people and real events into this fictional world that you've created for Bianca. I mean, as I said, Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks wander in, and other stars. The 1920s were a really interesting time in Hollywood. You're right. It's the rise of the celebrity movie star. There was a reach that people like Lily Langtry, or I'm trying to think of the other great actress that it'll come to me in a minute. But anyway, they never could achieve audiences of that size. But the movies made it possible. You know, it's like Instagram today or whatever, you know, where people acquire these huge numbers of followers. And as you say, he was so young, and medicine wasn't really up to snuff. And it's like Enrico Caruso and Houdini both died of very, you know, things that would easily be repaired today. But at that time, there just wasn't enough medical.
Part of it with Rudy was he had a perforated ulcer.
Right.
And he was so terrified of being operated on, he wouldn't let them operate on him until he was just full of infection. And
right.
So he kind of died of the massive infection.
Yeah, well, I think it was a version of toxic shock, which,
Yeah.
you know, was it, with antibiotics and other stuff in modern surgery, they could easily have cured. But I'm trying to remember, wasn't Houdini died of a perforated spleen?
Somebody punched him in the stomach.
Right.
And it was sometime right around that same time, somebody punched him in the stomach and perforated something.
I think it was his spleen. But yeah, but I mean, people that you did use to die from things that we could save them from now. Sorry, you were going to say something?
No, I said, I was agreed with you.
Oh, okay. Anyway, but meantime, while all this is going on, there are things to explore about Ted Oliver and his mission, and about Katie Dix and what's going on with her. And you've got a sequel coming, which I'm happy to say I have been able to read, with Dashiell Hammett as a focal figure. And so it really forms a trilogy by the time we get to it next year. The three books, The Wrong Girl and Valentina Will Die and what are you calling the Hammett book?
Well, at this point, I'm just calling it Dash.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, the Dashiell Hammett book.
Yeah.
We'll form a trilogy, and number of story elements will all, I'm happy to say, come together for those
The
who are
other thing
interested
that,
in
that
reading.
was it's really been fascinating for me in writing this series is in the 1920s. Of course, it was prohibition, and in Hollywood, of course, prohibition was nobody paid any attention to it at all. The cops were completely corrupt. Um, they all took bribes. The mayor was completely corrupt. They had it was only the FBI, it was only the feds who cared anything about prohibition. Every once in a while they'd come in and raid stuff, but there was all kinds of opportunity for the mob. And so one of the things that really fascinated me was that gambling was also a big deal, and gambling was illegal in California at the time. So somebody got really clever and decided to create a bunch of casinos on ships, and they'd take these casino ships and they'd anchor them outside the 3 mile limit off of the coast of California. And then they'd run ferry boats from the shore out to the casinos where people could just come and gamble all they wanted to because they were out of the U.S. jurisdiction. And the feds, though, they kept coming up with with arcane laws so that they could come out like piracy and things, so that they could go out and raid these ships. But these gambling ships were just perfect for the mob. And the California mob, or the Chicago mob, kept trying to get in on the California action with the movies and the gambling and the prostitution and the prohibition. They kept trying to get into it. Uh, the Hollywood mob, the California mob, was so powerful that they couldn't get in. Hollywood already has its own mob. So
Well, there was,
they kind of work together sometimes, but the outfit never could get a foothold in California because California had its own mob. So they gave me a lot of ideas as well, and they were all in bed together, the movies and the studios and the mob and the police and everything. It was just corruption. It's just rife. It was unbelievable.
well, there was a
So
lot
it
of
gives
money.
me lots and lots of ideas for writing.
Yeah, no,
A
absolutely.
lot
So
of
there
what?
was so much money floating around, and fame has a tendency to warp everything. And so police were subject to fame. Studios hired people to not just to provide muscle and protection, but also to intimidate. And cops could go on the payroll or, get into the movies or whatever. So it was a whole circular thing with all of that going on. Also, we should remember that there weren't a lot of people in Beverly Hills. It wasn't like today, but people could live in mansions and estates that were fairly isolated from one another. The real estate was at that point not so crowded. So a lot could go on in the
Oh,
confines of private homes. You
yes, absolutely.
yeah,
And
you
the
frozen up.
studios also. Have I frozen?
Yeah, I think you're coming
Can
back.
How am
There
I
was
doing?
you're back. There was a spell there where you kind of froze, but I think you're back. All right.
Okay, very good. As long as I'm back now. Okay. Well, I was going to say that especially as the 20s got to the 30s, the studio system was up really big, and they really took control of these people's lives, and they actually controlled them with drugs. They would actually sell or they'd actually give drugs to their stars to keep them in line. They'd give them uppers in the morning and then downers at night so that they could work 18 hours at a time, and also you'd get hooked. And they actually would control their stars with drugs. The studios did, and would get the drugs from the local mobsters. It was just a horrible racket, and it was really bad for stars. it's just an impossible situation to be in then.
Well, don't forget
When the
they
silent
didn't
movies
have
first
sound
started out, it was
they didn't have sound
yeah.
stages and so forth.
Whoops,
And
I'm
so,
losing you. Okay, I'm losing you, Barbara.
well, I'm here, but you keep fading in and out there. So I'm
Okay,
sorry I talk over you
kidding
because
me?
I can't see you talking. Um, I was just going to point out that because there was much more isolation, people could get up to things in their homes and whatever. That would be much more difficult today.
Yeah,
There wasn't all the surveillance stuff going on. Anyway, I
yeah.
do think you've got some very interesting characters there, and your solution to this particular book, which we won't go into, is certainly imaginative for those of you who haven't read, and you won't have because, in fact, it doesn't publish till Tuesday. Valentina Will Die. I think you'll find it a lot of fun, as well as historically interesting. And I really like, for all her selfishness and other qualities, I do think that Blanche is turning into an extremely interesting person um, and growing, and she's getting more responsible and kinder. And one of the things you bring out in the books, it's almost like an early version of Black Lives Matter, but because of I'm trying to think of the name. I'm sorry, I've gone blank on the name of the movie star who. Let me look it up here.
Alma.
Yeah, because of Alma's general factotum and so forth, a really interesting woman.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Miss Gilbert. Yeah.
yep, you get to talk about what life would have been like for her.
Yeah.
That it was not nearly so um, ruthlessly segregated as the South in California, but nonetheless, there were a lot of things that she couldn't do, and she too was protected to a great degree by Alma's fame and by all the money. And I think in the third book about Hammett, there are many facets of her life that come into play that I
Mhm.
think will, readers will find quite interesting.
When you write a historical series in the United States, especially, it's quite a fine line to walk. Also, these days you have to be careful about the idea of what cultural appropriation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to, as an elderly white woman, I don't want to pretend like I know what it was like, but I have eyes and I know what it was like when I was young uh, for people, and I can read people's experiences, and I don't want to pretend like it didn't happen.
No, you can't.
No.
And it's also, people spoke. I mean, my own parents did. There was a lot of casual
Oh yeah.
bigotry in conversation that didn't seem at all untoward at the time. I mean, and I think if you're writing an historical, you can't give penicillin to people who are ill, and you can't really whitewash the conversation so that it sounds okay to a modern ear when in fact it wasn't.
Right.
Um, no, I don't mean it wasn't. What I mean is, relevant to the time. I think you have to portray people the
Right.
way they were.
The way they were.
And that's always a hard part with historicals is how to screen out your own emotions, your own attitudes, the cultural things that are current today,
Mhm.
and yet you don't want the language to sound anachronistic.
No.
You want it to sound authentic. And the further you go back in time, the more difficult that becomes. If you're writing a medieval or an Elizabethan mystery, you can't really have dialogue exactly the way people spoke. I
No.
mean, if you tried if you ever tried to read Chaucer in the original English,
Yeah.
you can't do it today without serious assistance. But
Right.
you're only in the 1920s, so there's not an enormous change in the language, but there certainly is enormous changes in
The attitude.
the way that we deploy it and the attitudes that provoke us into speech.
I discovered that, of course, in that first series that I wrote was set in Oklahoma in the 1910s, and that really was a problem. That was really problematic. You talk about casual racism.
Yeah.
But California in the 20s, like you said, is more open than the South
Yeah.
in the teens. So she had more opportunity, and a lot of Black people were going out to California, uh, but it still wasn't. There were still sundown towns and uh, things that people couldn't do. It was much better in Los Angeles, in the Los Angeles area. But again, it's difficult, and like I said, you don't want to pretend like you know what it was like, and yet I think that his some historical authors are tempted to just not to avoid the whole subject,
Yeah.
avoid it altogether. And I don't want to you don't want to do that. I don't think anyway. I mean, you do want to acknowledge the reality of the situation. So I really admire that woman. Mrs. Gilbert is her name, and I really wanted to give her a full story, a real story.
Well, and she's a really important figure in Blanche's development. It's really not Alma, but Mrs. Gilbert who takes care of Blanche, brings her under her wing, and gives her a chance basically to get to Hollywood and look after her. And also, when you wrote the Alifair Tucker books back in Oklahoma, it wasn't just, it was actually more the Indian, the Native American, that were the subject of that kind of prejudice than it was. There were more of them than there were Black Americans in Oklahoma at the time you were writing. And you
Yeah,
always did a good job, I thought with those too. So I find your books, to be realistic and
interesting.
and
Yeah,
thoughtful.
I want to pretend like it didn't happen.
Right.
Yeah.
So I also wanted to mention, since we are doing a little Poison Pen Press event this afternoon, I have some copies of some recent books by other authors that over the years that I've acquired and edited and are now being published at Poison Pen Press and Source Books. One of them is Sarah Johnson, and this is her second book, and it's a forensic mystery set in uh, New Zealand. This one at Stewart Island. The first one was in Rotorua, and they do have a strong sense of place of history and the Maori culture, as well as forensics, and particularly our heroine here, Alexa, is got forensic skill is odontology. So you don't get that many odontologists. But the books are about New Zealand as well as forensics, and I think
Her first book was mud, the the one about the mud
Molten
pits,
Mud Murder
molten
was
mud
the
murder.
name of it,
That was really
because
fascinating idea.
Rotorua is like Yellowstone,
Uh-huh.
and there are those beautiful like Morning Glory Pool and so forth in Yellowstone that are volcanic springs. And so in Rotorua, there are a number of those where the mud is boiling essentially. And so the first one is found in one of those mud holes. And obviously it's been boiled away because of the extreme heat. And so it takes the odontology, it takes the teeth to figure out to do the identification, and then it goes on from there. I think it's a really interesting series. Her third book, which I loved reading and will be out next year, or later this year, I think, takes place on the Milford Track, which is the famous hike across it's southern New Zealand. So it goes from Queenstown over to Milford Sound, and it's a very famous hiking trail, and bad things happen along the trail. Sarah had actually hiked it. I have driven it, and then I've sailed across Milford Sound, but I have not actually hiked this trail. But New Zealand is full of extreme sports enthusiasts, let me tell you. So it takes a younger author to do that. Now, this one called Laying Bones is, we're now in 1969 in tiny Center Springs, Texas, with Constable Ned Parker and his crew. The first book was called The Rock Hole, and this is a wonderful series by Revis Wortham. And it's historical, but it depends on where we draw the line. I mean, we're talking really basically the late 50s through the late 60s. And by now, since we're in 2021, I guess that qualifies as historical. I mean, it's just part of my life when I was young, so I have trouble thinking of it as history, but there we go.
One thing
But
about
anyway, this one is really interesting because it involves they all, because this is a border area, there are always questions about it. But in this case, it's a border area within Texas, and there's any number of bad things that go on. And there's a couple of kids in this series that are wonderful, and they end up, as a rule, being an integral part of the mystery. So, Laying Bones is the, I think, eighth book in this series. Rockhole is the first one, just been reissued with an introduction by Joe Lansdale, and I really recommend it. It's a wonderful series, and lots of,
one thing about Revis's series is that he and I are about the same age, and when I read his books, that's just the way I grew up. It's the same area, it's the same place, the people
yeah,
talk the same. It's just an absolutely wonderful and fascinating series. I really
it
love
is.
these
Well,
books.
I have a book that's going to be new to you. This is one of the last books that I myself acquired. It's called The Silenced Women. And it is a police procedural, takes place in Santa Rosa, California. Detective Eddie Mahler and his violent crime investigations team work the case. But one of the things that fascinated me about this, it's very well written, and Fred, the author, has a lot of background in psychology and so forth. There's a serial killer involved, but I love the fact that the police detective, instead of being an alcoholic or a sex addict or a doper or suffering from PTSD, I mean, it's so often true that in crime fiction, the lead character has got some flaw, some terrible flaw that he has to, or she battles against while solving crime. Well, in this case, the sort of PTSD that our hero here, Eddie, suffers from is migraines. And they are truly debilitating. And I was so captured because I have a daughter who suffers from terrible migraines, two daughters actually, but one worse than the other. I was so captured by the way he wrote about what it would be like to have a migraine
Uh-huh.
descend upon you and grip you. And then in a critical moment in the story, towards the denouement, when Eddie has to act, the migraine comes down on him, and you don't know whether he's going to be able to do what he needs to do.
What a fascinating idea. It's a
It
fascinating.
really is,
Who's
and
the
he's
author? What's her?
his name is Frederick Weisel, and the book's called The Silenced Women. The red dress there on the bench is because the body that was found on the bench on the park has got draped in red. And he's written a sequel, which I've already read and which I like a lot, in which Eddie is back, and there's a team, and there's a young woman who um, left the FBI. She couldn't deal with the trauma of being an FBI agent and working some difficult crimes. So she's on his team now in the violent crime unit in Santa Rosa. And she's an interesting character that gets to grow. And I like it in series, where um, you have other characters that you care about, and they're pulled along. But I think second books are hard to write, as you know. And well, they are for everybody, and especially when you've had a big success with the first book, it's hard. But I think that Fred's second book, and I have no idea what the title is because that's always up in the air. I think it lives up to the first book, so that's a new series that I recommend. And the last one I'm going to bring up is, and Sulari, you've met
Oh yeah,
Sulari, who is
absolutely.
our Australian and how we love her. And this is Roland Sinclair is basically a 1930s Australian Lord Peter Wimsey. He's rich. He's interested in crime. Well, Lord Peter, I would not describe him as bohemian, but nonetheless, when he courted Harriet Vane, he stepped outside the social boundaries and really the moral strictures of his time. We just rewatched the three um, television presentations with Edward Featherbridge, who I thought was fabulous. And it was the three Harriet. They never did Busman's Honeymoon because there were four Harriet Vanes, but it ended with Gouty Night, which set at Oxford, which I loved. And I thought about Roland. because he has three people who live with him, a poet and a painter and a woman who's a sculptress. And because he has so much money, he's able to support them. And so they're this kind of unconventional household. And they end up solving crimes. But what's interesting is the 1930s. We so focus on Europe and America and fascism and then the rise of the Nazis and the communists, the Spanish Civil War, all of that. I never gave a lot of thought to what it would have been like in Australia, presumably New Zealand, but particularly Australia. And all the same things were going on. So Roland is very much engaged with both the fascist right and the progressive left and terrible immigration laws, all kinds of stuff that are true of Australia in the 1930s. And you can see Sulari writing it towards war. But this one is one of my total favorites. It's called Shanghai Secrets. And in this, Roland and his housemates go from Sydney to Shanghai to represent the Sinclair family interests at international negotiations. And you know that Roland is going to totally blow anything to do with global commerce because, I mean, he's just, totally not interested. His older brother runs the family fortune and so Roland basically gets all of his money from the family estate and the brother. But then we have a beautiful Russian taxi girl who claimed to be Princess Anastasia, and she's murdered. And out of sympathy for her, and also because he's a suspect because he had been dancing with her the night she was killed, Roland and his companions have to start an investigation, but they're doing this in Shanghai, which is not like Hong Kong. It's not British. It's Chinese.
Yeah.
And meantime, as we know, the Japanese are advancing on China. I mean, up in the north, we're not that far from the rape of Nanking and so forth. I just find the whole series to be completely fascinating.
Well, Solari is one author that kind of makes me green with envy when I read her books, and I admire her a lot. She just comes up with the most wonderful ideas. I haven't read the Shanghai one yet, though.
It's great. It's just now out, and I can tell you that from this one, which is the 9th, the next one they moved from Shanghai to Boston, and there's a very interesting. It's called Where There's a Will, and there's Roland has a friend in Boston that he feels some responsibility to. And so they wind up in Boston. And it kind of is, it's a whole cycle. At the end of it, they're on their way back to Australia. But it's like a 10-book cycle that takes us from A House Divided, the first book, which has just been reissued, was originally called A Few Right Thinking Men. And it takes us from Australia, it takes us to Germany, it takes us to England. They cross the ocean and wind up in New York. Now there's sort of a Western one in Western Australia, all kinds of fun stuff. And now they're in Shanghai and then they go to Boston. So, I just find it an amazing series.
I'm finding it. Oh, I love these things where you can, that's the only way to travel nowadays is through books. I'm finding it difficult it's hard to do the research and my California research if you have to do it from home. You just have to contact everyone who lives in that wherever it is that you're gonna write about now. But it's difficult when you just have to rely on your memory now when you can't travel. So you just have to do it. You just have to do it by reading books like Solari's.
Well, I think for enjoying travel, yes, you do. But let's face it, you can't go back to 1920s Hollywood any more than Solari can actually go to 1935 Shanghai.
That's a good point. I know what it smells like. I know what the air feels like. I know what it looks like. But the way it was in 1920 is a whole nother ball of wax.
It really is. My father was a real football hero at Northwestern University. Went out to play a game in California. I think he told me about it. It was before I was born, obviously, so I didn't get to see it. But how amazing it was, to get to California, and there were orange trees everywhere, and it was country. And I can even remember when I was a freshman at Stanford going down to a Stanford game in Los Angeles, and Disneyland had just opened. And there were still orange trees everywhere. You didn't have all the motels and restaurants and everything, and it was way out in the country.
Mhm.
And having gone back, maybe it's been some years since I've been there. You would never, I just couldn't even recognize uh, what it was like. Let
Yeah.
me check with young Patrick over there. Do we have some questions or comments from Facebook? So Pat King is the masked bandit, is monitoring the Facebook feed. So here he comes to let us know.
Just lots of love from the fans.
Lots of loves from the fans, it says.
We like.
Friends from the store, David Hunenberg and Nans. I'll say hi to
Oh, all right.
Donis.
David Hunenberg says hi. Nan Beam says hi.
Yeah, just really nice. Gwen Ward wrote a really nice comment that Wrong Girl was her favorite book of 2020. So it started it
Oh.
off right.
So someone said that Wrong Girl was her favorite book of 2020. So she's excited to know that Valentino is now, well, we'll be here Tuesday. Right.
Oh, well, that's very
That
nice.
about it?
That's about it. Just lots of love and congratulations.
Wonderful.
Well, that's what I like to hear. Well, I'll tell you, doing the research and learning about the movies in the 20s has just been just tremendous fun. It's just tremendous fun about how they had to do their own makeup, and people with blue eyes. They couldn't shoot people with blue eyes because their eyes would disappear. And that's why they have this huge makeup
Right.
out of the 20s and things. It's just incredibly fascinating. And now I'm about to embark upon the sound era, and that's going to be a whole new thing for me.
Absolutely. No, I can certainly see that, the advent of the talkies, as they said, will really change things. And I was going to ask you to wind this up. Is Bianca well prepared for talkies? I mean, who was it that was such a star and his voice was so awful that he
John Gilbert.
yeah,
Was it John
never made the transition to the talkies because once he spoke, it was all over.
Yeah. Uh-huh. So, well, yeah, that's going to be a problem for her because, of course, she had a rather heavy accent to begin with, and she spent a long time trying to get rid of her Oklahoma accent. So she
Right.
speaks slowly and low, So we're going to see how it goes. So it'll be fun.
It will be. You can bring in a voice coach and all those kinds of
Yeah, there we go.
Right. Well, Donis, it's really been a treat to talk to you. And I think your books are due to arrive on Monday. So you'll come down here to the store in your mask and sign copies for all your fans, right?
I will indeed.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. And thank
Okay,
you all for
thank you.
joining us this afternoon. It was wonderful to have you. And here comes the masked bandit to to take us off Facebook because I don't really even know how to do that. So here you go.
Looking forward to seeing you in person once someday.
Me too. Thanks, Donis.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.